You walked away without the weight they hoped you'd carry. No guilt, no regret, no second guessing. Just a calm, calculated smirk that told them everything they needed to know but were never ready to accept. That expression alone rewrote the entire history between you. It was the final punctuation to a story they thought they controlled. That smirk wasn't arrogance. It was liberation. It was the subtle message that you finally understood your worth, your power, and your role in the chaos they created. They thought you'd crumble, but instead you rose, and your rise tasted like vengeance dipped in elegance. They waited for an apology. They waited for desperation. They waited for closure crafted on their terms. But you gave them none of it. You left them standing in their own mess, forced to confront everything they tried to project onto you. You walked away clean, and they stayed dirty. That smirk cut deeper than any argument ever could. You didn't shout. You didn't explain. You didn't defend yourself. You simply turned your back with a softness that felt sharper than a knife, because nothing terrifies a guilty conscience more than the person they wronged walking away unbothered. They expected you to break, to crumble, to beg for what they were never capable of giving. Instead, you gave them a look that said, "I'm done here," and you meant it in the bones of your soul. That was the moment they realized they had underestimated the silence inside you. They never thought you'd reach a point where their opinions meant nothing. But you did, and in that instant, you became untouchable. That smirk was the final reminder that you weren't trapped anymore, you were free. And freedom looks terrifying to the ones who depended on your pain. Every step you took away from them forced them to replay every mistake they made. And that smirk? It lived in their mind like a shadow they couldn't shake. They saw confidence in it. They saw clarity. They saw a version of you they never bothered to know, a version that didn't need them. You didn't need dramatic exits or emotional theatrics. Your silence was the exit. Your composure was the performance. They realized too late that you weren't leaving out of hurt, you were leaving out of realization. Realization that you deserved more than the bare minimum they kept offering. Your smirk wasn't petty, it was poetic. It was the final proof that you had nothing left to say to someone who never listened. And the irony was cruel. They finally understood you right when your back was already turned. They couldn't understand how you walked away so easily, but it wasn't easy, it was earned. Earned through nights of overthinking, conversations with yourself, and silent battles they never saw. When you finally left, it wasn't impulsive. It was the cleanest decision you ever made. And that clean decision cut them messily. Because while you walked away with clarity, they were left behind with confusion. While you walked away with peace, they stayed with chaos. While you walked away with a smirk, they stayed with memories that suddenly felt heavier than ever. They're haunted by how effortless you seemed, how you didn't look back, how you didn't hesitate, how your body language screamed, "I'm too good for this," without uttering a word. That alone broke them more than any breakup or betrayal ever could. Your departure was the mirror they refused to look into. And now, every time they think of you, they remember that last look, the one that held no fear, no pain, no longing. Just calm detachment. Just cold confidence. Just a smirk that said, "You should have treated me better." You walked away like you were closing a chapter you'd already outgrown. And that scared them, because they were still stuck on pages you had memorized, analyzed, and abandoned long ago. They weren't ready for your evolution, but you were born for it. That smirk was revenge without violence, closure without conversation, justice without conflict. It was the purest form of self-respect, wrapped in the quietest expression. And that's exactly why it shook them to their core. They expected you to leave pieces of yourself behind, the emotional version of you, the fragile version, the forgiving version. But you carried every version of yourself with you and left only the memory of what they lost. And that memory now stings worse than any goodbye. Your indifference became their punishment. Your calmness became their consequence. Your walk away became the moment they realized the power balance had finally shifted in your favor without you having to lift a single finger. They replay that moment more than they'll ever admit. The way your eyes didn't soften, the way your shoulders didn't tense, the way your footsteps didn't pause. They realized you weren't walking away from them, you were walking toward yourself. They didn't just lose you. They lost the version of themselves they liked when they were around you. They lost the comfort of being forgiven. They lost the upper hand they thought they had. And all of that hit them only when they saw the way you smiled on your way out. That smirk has become a reminder of your strength, a reminder of their weakness, a reminder that they were a chapter, not the book, and that the story continues with or without them. They expected guilt. They expected remorse. They expected you to feel something heavy, but all they saw was someone who finally understood that walking away doesn't make you heartless, staying in the wrong place does. Your detachment wasn't cold, it was clarity. It was the silent recognition that sometimes the cleanest break is the one made without emotion. You didn't walk away angry, you walked away awake. And now, every time they think of you, the image remains frozen. You leaving, steady, unshaken, done. A soft smirk on your lips. The last thing they saw, the last thing they deserved, and the last thing they'll never forget. They keep wondering how you managed to walk away without the slightest tremor in your voice, without any hesitation in your steps. What they don't understand is that the moment you stopped expecting anything from them, you stopped needing anything from them. And when need dies, attachment follows. Your smirk wasn't rebellion, it was rebirth. They search for a flaw in your exit, a crack, a weakness, something to prove you weren't as unbothered as you appeared. But they find nothing, because there was nothing. Your silence wasn't emptiness, it was a verdict. And they know deep down, it was the only verdict they deserved. They have sleepless nights replaying everything they did that led to that moment. Every lie, every manipulation, every disrespect. They thought they got away with it all, right up until you walked away with that calm expression that told them they never had you to begin with. They only had access, and you revoked it. Your smirk became their punishment because it held the truth they avoided. You were never theirs to break. They thought they damaged you, but you were simply shedding the last pieces of who you were around them. Your transformation was their undoing, and that realization burns them more than any insult ever could. Your silence forced them to confront what they had been running from their own behavior. They can no longer blame you because your exit was too clean, too graceful, too intentional. Their own guilt became the noise they can't shut off now, echoing louder than any explanation you could have given. They keep checking your life from a distance, hoping to find signs of collapse. But all they see is growth, expansion, peace. You didn't just walk away, you evolved. And evolution is the one thing they could never keep up with. Now they sit on the sidelines of a story they used to feel entitled to. What scares them the most is how little you care about what they think now. Your detachment is powerful, almost dangerous. It reminds them of what they took for granted, someone who once gave them unconditional loyalty, now offering them nothing but silence. And that silence is louder than revenge. Your confidence is unsettling to them. You carry yourself like someone who knows exactly what they survived, someone who knows their own value, someone who refuses to negotiate their worth. They never met this version of you before, and it terrifies them because they know they created it. The shift in your energy exposed every weakness in theirs. Suddenly their tricks, their games, their tactics don't work on you anymore. You can see through them without effort. That smirk you left with wasn't mockery, it was recognition. You finally recognize their patterns, and they know they've lost their power. There comes a point in life where trying again is no longer noble, it's self-betrayal. You learned that the hard way. You gave chances, you gave patience, you gave understanding, and none of it changed the ending. So now the story has a period, not a comma. There is no sequel, no reconciliation, no part 2. When you close a chapter, it stays shut. Because people thought maybe meant there was still time. They thought someday meant they still existed in the future you were building. They thought we can fix this was your default response. They didn't realize those words expired the moment you learned to choose yourself. You stopped living in emotional installments. You collected what dignity remained and walked forward without looking back. You're not heartless, you just stopped bleeding for people who never deserved your wounds in the first place. Everyone wants forgiveness until they realize forgiveness doesn't come with access. You forgave, yes, but you also removed the entry card. That's the part they didn't expect. People confuse silence with softness, but silence is the sharpest ending. When you gave no explanation, no fight, no emotional performance, they panicked. Because once you stop arguing, it means the decision has already been made inside you. People aren't scared of anger, they're terrified of peace. You realize that going back would only reopen old pain. What's the point of stitching a wound just to hand someone the needle again? You would rather walk with a scar that healed than re-enter a battlefield you already survived. Growth means refusing to revisit what almost destroyed you. Sometimes they don't understand because they believe you owe them closure. But closure doesn't come from a conversation, it comes from a decision. You gave yourself closure when you chose not to return. They don't get to co-sign your healing. That phase of your life was signed off without their approval. People always assume the door stays open for them, especially when they took you for granted. They assume they can leave, disrespect, break trust, wander, and return whenever they feel like it. But life isn't a revolving door. You realize that you are a destination, not an airport runway for temporary landings. The version of you that would have considered a second chance doesn't exist anymore. Growth changed you. Pain matured you. Betrayal sculpted you. You outgrew the idea of begging someone to treat you right. Once you learn your worth, your standards become non-negotiable. When you turned your back and never returned, it sent a louder message than words ever could. They finally understood that silence is not empty, it's full of the truth you no longer cared to explain. They were suddenly forced to face what they did without the distraction of your presence. They will replay old conversations in their head. They will wonder when exactly you detached. But detachment doesn't happen on the last day. It happens silently, slowly, long before you walk out the door. By the time you physically left, emotionally you were already gone. People who lose you never realize it at the moment they do. They realize later when the calls don't go through, the messages stay unread, and the familiar version of you doesn't exist anymore. That is the real heartbreak, not losing someone, but losing access to someone who once cared deeply. You became the lesson, not the return. You became the memory that teaches them not to push people too far. And there is power in that. Your absence becomes your revenge. Your silence becomes your justice. Your peace becomes the punishment they never expected. They thought time heals everything, but time doesn't reopen doors. Time shows you why those doors needed to close. The longer you stayed away, the clearer everything became. Distance is a mirror, and in that reflection you saw who they truly were, not who you wanted them to be. People think strength is holding on, but sometimes real strength is walking away and never checking if they followed. That's the kind of strength you built. You stopped breaking yourself to keep others comfortable. You chose your sanity over their chaos, and the world changed when you did. Your heart stopped being a doormat for recurring guests. You turned it into a boundary. Once the door shuts, it's not locked out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. Not everyone deserves a second entrance. You also learn that not every relationship deserves a comeback arc. Some are meant to end. Some people are meant to be chapters, not the whole book. You stop trying to force supporting characters into lead roles. Their part in your story ended, and that's perfectly fine. They may come back with apologies, new stories, new promises, new regrets. But I'm sorry doesn't restore what trust destroyed. Sorry doesn't unbreak what they shattered. Sorry is not a time machine. They should have thought before the damage was done. When you walked away, you took your love, loyalty, compassion, and patience with you. Now, someone else will receive what they mishandled. Someone else will get the version of you they failed to protect, and that is a consequence they will have to live with. They lost the privilege of experiencing your growth firsthand. You won't return just to show them how strong you've become. Your healing is not a performance. You don't owe anyone a front row seat to your comeback, especially those who cheered when you were low. You realize that some endings are not tragedies, they are liberation. Closing the door didn't hurt you. Staying would have. You chose freedom over familiarity, peace over history, self-worth over emotional recycling. That's evolution. People who break something inside you don't get to complain about who you become after. They don't get to be surprised when the access ends, the doors shut, and the chapters close. Actions have consequences, and losing you was theirs. Even if they say, "We can fix this," you know that going back would be like trying to resurrect something that died for a reason. Love without trust is a body without a heartbeat. Why try to revive something that stopped breathing long ago? And now when they call and get silence, when they reach out and get distance, when they finally understand you're gone for good, they will realize something painful. They weren't just losing the relationship, they were losing the chance to try again. Some people only realize the value of a door once it closes and not a second before. When access was easy, they took it for granted. When your heart was open, they walked through without wiping their feet. But the moment it closed, they realized there was no spare key, no hidden entrance, no back door. You weren't playing hard to get, you were gone. They will tell themselves you're being dramatic, stubborn, cold. But deep inside, they know the truth. You just reached a point of no return. A point where the damage outgrew the investment. A point where it cost more to stay than to leave. And when that moment arrives, even love has to step aside and let self-respect take the wheel. You learn that forgiveness is not the same as access. You can release the anger and still refuse to return to the fire. You can let go of the pain without inviting the same hands that caused it to touch you again. Healing is not an invitation, it's separation. You grow apart from what once wounded you. Some people only change when they lose you, but by then the change doesn't matter anymore. You needed effort then, not after. You needed accountability in the moment, not apologies once the damage became irreversible. Your heart was not a trial version they get to upgrade later. It was the full version from the beginning, they just didn't know how to use it. People assume they'll get closure when they finally realize what they did. But closure doesn't work like that. Closure is what you give yourself when you stop waiting for understanding from someone who never cared to understand in the first place. The closure came when you shut the emotional door, not when they knocked on it again. They think life should give them another chance. They think time owes them a redo. They think the universe should align so they can correct their mistakes. But life doesn't work on their schedule. Sometimes the bridge burns while they're still planning how to cross it, and by the time they return, all that remains is ash and memory. They'll talk to themselves in circles, trying to decode your silence. They'll reread old messages. They'll recall conversations. They'll analyze their behavior and finally see what you saw long before. They weren't ready for someone with your heart, your consistency, your loyalty. And life doesn't hold seats for the unprepared. You used to meet people halfway, then you learned that halfway for others was barely 10% for you. You carried everything: communication, effort, patience, fixing problems they caused. When you stopped carrying it, the entire structure collapsed. And that collapse showed you who was building with you and who was just living in the house. They always thought you'd come back because that's what you used to do. They were banking on your history, not realizing history doesn't repeat once the author rewrites their standards. You taught them a lesson that life eventually teaches everyone. Loyalty is beautiful until it starts killing the person offering it. In the end, what scared them wasn't losing you, it was realizing they were never getting another chance to prove themselves. That door wasn't closed temporarily, it was welded shut. They can stand outside for years offering apologies, regrets, and explanations, but none of it changes the fact that you moved on without them. They still can't understand how their story flipped so suddenly. One moment they were the center of your attention, the main character in your world, the star of every scene, and then, almost overnight, the camera shifted, the lighting dimmed, and their role shrank to something forgettable. They were spoiled by the version of you who poured effort, attention, reassurance, and loyalty into them. They got addicted to being prioritized, to being the one who mattered most. They never believed there could be a world where you simply stopped caring until it arrived. They didn't realize that being treated special was never a guarantee, it was a choice. And when someone takes your kindness and mistakes it for weakness, the choice is revoked elegantly, silently, and without warning. They thought your affection was permanent. They thought being chosen today meant being chosen forever. And that assumption was their downfall, because they never understood that love is not a contract, it is a privilege. They never saw the shift coming. One day, you were all in, giving the kind of warmth most people never receive. Then suddenly you were detached, indifferent, unbothered. And their confusion wasn't because you changed, it was because they forced the change. They told themselves you would chase, cling, and panic if they pulled away or showed disrespect. They thought they could play games with someone who genuinely cared. But they forgot that the sweetest souls have limits, and when they reach those limits, the switch flips. They thought they had time to return your energy, time to treat you right later, time to fix what they were breaking. But the time ran out while they were busy taking you for granted. At first, you gave them everything. Your presence, your loyalty, your softness, your patience. You made them feel chosen in a way no one else ever had. And they believed that treatment was guaranteed, because they were too blinded by entitlement. You didn't demote them, they demoted themselves with their behavior. You didn't turn cold, they turned you cold. You didn't fall out of love, they pushed you out with their own hands. And when you finally treated them like a side character, they couldn't stand it. But they never considered that they made themselves irrelevant by acting as if losing you was impossible. What really stings them is not that you changed, but that the new version of you flourished without needing them. You didn't beg, you didn't plead, you didn't negotiate, you simply rewrote the script and recast the lead. They now understand a painful truth. You treated them special because they were special to you, not because you had to. They didn't value that when they had it, and now they miss something they can never get back. They're shocked that someone who once made them feel so important can walk past them like a stranger. But that's how life works. When respect disappears, so does priority. They thought they could break your heart and still keep their place in your life. They didn't realize you don't hold seats for people who walk out in the middle of the movie. They can't accept that the same person who once made room for them in every decision now moves through the world without consulting them at all. That shift in power is what truly terrifies them. Your silence and distance were not punishment, they were evolution. You upgraded, and they were still running the outdated version of the story where they were relevant. They believed you would always return, always forgive, always show up, even after they gave you every reason not to. And now that you haven't, their ego is choking on the reality. They replay the past because the present is unbearable. In the past they were adored. In the present they are just another face in the crowd, and their pride can't handle the downgrade. They laugh and joke on the outside, pretending they don't care. But deep down they know you never lost them, they lost you. And losing someone who genuinely loved you is a loss you feel forever. They thought they were irreplaceable until they saw just how easily you adapted without them. Your glow never dimmed, and that alone shattered whatever superiority they believed they had. They didn't realize you weren't just giving love, you were also studying them. And when the study was complete, you closed the book and walked away with the lesson. Now they finally see why they were treated like the main character at first, because you were giving them a chance to rise. They had the spotlight, the script, the opportunity, but they threw it away. When you demoted them to a side character, you didn't do it out of revenge. You did it because the story was moving forward, and they stopped growing. You outgrew the scene and they got left behind in the last chapter. Now they watch your life like an audience member, realizing the plot never needed them to continue. And that is the twist that hurts the most. They didn't lose importance because you changed, they lost importance because they didn't. And in the end, the credits rolled without their name at the top, not because you erased them, but because they never earned their place in the final cut. They never imagined that someone who once made them feel like the center of the universe could learn to live as if they never existed. That transformation haunts them. It proves you were not dependent, you were simply giving, and the moment you stopped giving, the entire relationship collapsed because they brought nothing to hold it together. They thought they were irreplaceable because they mistook your loyalty for helplessness. They mistook your patience for fear of losing them. But the truth surfaced the moment you walked away. Your loyalty was a choice, not a weakness, and once withdrawn, their value was exposed for what it was, temporary and overestimated. They now realize the danger of taking a good person for granted. Good people don't always stay good after they're hurt. Some walk away quietly. Some build walls. Some sharpen themselves into something new. You became the version they created through their own neglect. It eats them alive that you didn't need a dramatic exit, no shouting, no threats, no confrontation, just a smooth disappearance that spoke louder than any breakup speech could have. The quietness of your departure screamed, "I outgrew this." They scroll past your success, pretending it doesn't bother them, but every achievement, every glow-up, every moment of your growth reminds them of how monumental the loss was. They don't envy your life, they envy the version of themselves they could have become if they had treated you right. People always assume strength is loud, but your strength was silent. Silent when they tested your patience. Silent when they disrespected you. Silent when they offered less than they received. By the time they realized silence meant you were done, the bridge was already ash. They thought they understood you, but they never noticed how observant you were. You saw the patterns, the manipulation, the entitlement. You just waited to be sure. Once the picture was clear, you unplugged your emotions, and they never saw the switch flip. They believed the story could not continue without them. But the most painful revelation was watching your life not just continue but upgrade. Your peace stabilized, your priorities recalibrated, and the world didn't collapse when they left. Their ego did. It shocks them that the same person who once made them feel adored and significant now doesn't even flinch at their absence. That kind of emotional control is terrifying to someone who expected to forever hold emotional power over you. They didn't realize you weren't cold, you were healed. And healing doesn't come with explanations. When you detach with peace, it shakes people who expected revenge, confrontation, or emotional begging. Peace shows who was really dependent. They once bragged about being the most important person in your life. Now they avoid mentioning your name because it reminds them they're not even part of the cast anymore. From lead role to uncredited background extra, that's a fall no ego forgets. They replay the past not because they miss you, but because they miss who they were when you loved them. You made them the best version of themselves, and they destroyed that gift with their arrogance. Now they are left with a downgraded self that only shines in memory. The hardest thing for them to accept is that you didn't seek replacement, you improved your inner world instead. They thought you'd jump into another arms for validation, but you chose self-evolution. And nothing threatens insecure souls like someone who grows alone. You treating them like a side character was not cruelty, it was justice. You simply placed them in the role they earned with their actions. When someone doesn't show up for the story moves on without them. It's that simple. They wanted to be missed, but they ended up being forgotten. And nothing is more brutal than realizing someone has healed so completely that the memory of you no longer triggers emotion, not pain, not anger, not even nostalgia. They're shocked because they were still comfortable standing on something you had already decided was unsafe. They thought the bridge was permanent just because they were enjoying the view. They never noticed the cracks forming beneath their feet. They assumed you would warn them first, give signs, give chances, but you had already given more than enough before you ever reached that decision. By the time they realized danger existed, you were already done crossing. They thought you'd wait until they stepped off, that you'd be considerate of their position. They didn't understand that self-preservation doesn't ask permission from people who caused the damage. They stood there confidently, thinking access to you was guaranteed. They never imagined you would remove the entire path instead of negotiating terms. That kind of finality stunned them. They're shocked because burning the bridge wasn't emotional. It was deliberate, calm, calculated. You didn't act out of rage, you acted out of clarity. They thought the bridge belonged to both of you. They didn't realize it was built from your patience, your effort, your forgiveness. Once you withdrew those materials, there was nothing left to stand on. They assumed distance would be temporary, that silence was a phase. They never considered that silence could be structural, a permanent removal. They kept standing there, expecting you to come back and explain. But you don't explain demolitions. You just clear the area and move on. They're shocked because you didn't burn it slowly. You didn't weaken it piece by piece. You ended it completely, leaving no safe way back. They wanted closure while remaining connected. You understood that real closure sometimes requires isolation, not conversation. They believed the bridge was indestructible because it had survived previous damage. They didn't realize repeated strain eventually reaches a breaking point. They're shocked because you didn't look back to see if they were okay. You had already checked on them too many times while ignoring yourself. They thought you'd never choose yourself at their expense. Burning the bridge proved them wrong, and that truth unsettled them deeply. They stayed standing, still talking, still assuming relevance, while the ground beneath them disappeared. That disconnect is what shook them most. They thought bridges only burned during fights. They never expected one to disappear during calm silence. They're shocked because you didn't need a dramatic ending. No explosion, no scene, just decisive action and distance. They believed history would protect the bridge. But history doesn't matter when the present is disrespectful. They assumed access was permanent because you once allowed it. They didn't understand that permission can be revoked without explanation. They stood there thinking you were bluffing. You weren't. You simply stopped building. They're shocked because you didn't burn the bridge to punish them. You burned it to protect yourself. They expected regret to pull you back. Instead, peace pushed you forward. They stayed on the bridge trying to call you back, but you had already reached land that didn't require them. They didn't realize how long you had been preparing for this moment internally. The decision looked sudden to them, it wasn't. They're shocked because you didn't leave debris behind. No lingering messages, no unfinished emotions, just absence. They thought you'd rebuild eventually. They didn't understand that some bridges are removed so they can never be crossed again. They stayed standing because they assumed you needed them on the other side. You proved you didn't. They expected guilt to slow you down. But guilt disappears when self-respect finally takes control. They're shocked because you didn't burn the bridge out of hate. You burned it out of acceptance. They thought you'd miss the connection more than the damage. You chose safety over sentiment. They remained frozen, trying to process what happened. You were already adapting to a world without them. They assumed they'd always have a way back. Burning the bridge destroyed that illusion. They're shocked because you didn't negotiate boundaries. You eliminated the need for them. They thought the bridge gave them leverage. They never realized it gave you exhaustion. They stayed standing because they never believed you'd choose finality. That belief cost them access. They're shocked because once the bridge was gone, you didn't look conflicted. You looked relieved. They wanted explanation. You gave them silence. Silence is what remains when everything has already been said. They stood there watching smoke rise, realizing too late that comfort doesn't equal security. They thought you needed the bridge more than they did. Burning it proved who was actually carrying the weight. They're shocked because you didn't destroy the bridge impulsively. You dismantled it mentally long before the fire. They stayed behind with questions echoing in the air. You walked forward without needing answers. And the truth they can't escape is this: you didn't burn the bridge to strand them. You burned it because staying connected was costing you yourself. They're still trying to understand how something they relied on vanished without negotiation. They assumed shared history created immunity. They never realized immunity expires when disrespect becomes routine. They thought the bridge was a safety net, not realizing it was slowly strangling you. What kept them comfortable was costing you peace. They're shocked because you didn't wait for them to acknowledge the damage. You stopped expecting awareness from people who benefited from your silence. They assumed you'd choose harmony over honesty forever. Burning the bridge proved that survival outranks harmony. They stood there calling your decision extreme. But extreme is what happens when moderate warnings are ignored repeatedly. They believed the bridge would always exist because you were the one maintaining it. Once you stopped, collapse was inevitable. They're shocked because you didn't stagger away wounded. You walked away steady, like someone finally free of unnecessary responsibility. They tried to reframe the ending as cruelty, but cruelty is forcing yourself to stay where you're shrinking. They expected you to miss them louder than you missed your peace. You chose peace, and that answer was final. They stood there hoping the fire would die down. It didn't. You don't rebuild what already proved unsafe. They're shocked because you didn't burn it halfway. Partial exits leave return paths. You didn't want one. They thought the bridge defined the relationship. You realized the relationship was already gone. The bridge was just denial. They stood there with regret finally arriving on time, too late to matter. They're shocked because you didn't wait for an apology. Apologies without change are just noise. They believed your kindness would outlive their carelessness. Burning the bridge corrected that assumption. They expected nostalgia to pull you back. But nostalgia loses power when peace shows up. They stood there confused, replaying moments they thought secured your loyalty. Loyalty doesn't survive repeated disregard. They're shocked because you didn't announce your departure. Real exits don't require speeches. They tried to frame you as heartless, but hearts break when they stay too long in unsafe places. They expected guilt to slow you down, but guilt fades when self-respect takes over. They're shocked because you didn't burn the bridge to hurt them. You burned it to stop hurting yourself. They stood there realizing access to you was never guaranteed, it was earned and maintained. They believed distance would weaken you. Distance sharpened you. They're shocked because the bridge didn't collapse under anger, it disappeared under resolve. They stood there alone, understanding finally what you learned earlier: some connections don't end loudly, they end completely. They're still trying to convince themselves the bridge mattered more than it did. But once it burned, they learned the truth: it mattered only because you kept it standing. They didn't expect how little chaos followed. No collapse in your life, no visible damage, just stability where tension used to live. They thought you'd feel lonely after burning it. Instead, you felt lighter. Freedom has a way of filling spaces that obligation once occupied. They stood there blaming timing, circumstances, misunderstandings, but none of that rebuilds what was already unsafe. They're shocked because you didn't reach back in a moment of weakness. Weakness never came, relief did. They assumed the fire would cool and leave ruins to walk across. But there were no ruins. You cleared everything. They didn't realize how long you'd been preparing internally. The bridge burned fast, but the decision took years. They expected the loss to hurt you more than it hurt them. But you had already grieved while still connected. They stood there staring at smoke, realizing comfort had blinded them to consequence. They're shocked because once it was gone, you didn't speak about it again. Silence confirmed permanence. They thought endings require mutual agreement. You proved self-preservation needs no consensus. They waited for you to soften. You hardened into clarity. They assumed you'd miss what was familiar. But familiarity without respect becomes suffocating. They're shocked because the fire didn't rage, it settled. And that calm made it undeniable. They stood there understanding too late that bridges aren't burned in anger, they're burned in acceptance. They expected ashes to pull you back. But ashes don't rebuild paths. They finally understood you didn't destroy a connection. You removed a liability and walked forward without looking back.